Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving straight into a totally fascinating and honestly pretty alarming economic reality that's quietly reshaping the globe right under our noses. Down at the Strait of Hormuz, which we all know is one of the absolute most critical maritime arteries on the planet, a profound shift is happening. Ships are actually paying for passage. We're going to break down exactly how this geopolitical conflict is transforming a vital international waterway into a literal toll booth, and more importantly, how this is sending massive economic ripples right through our global supply chains.
So, it really begs the question, what actually happens when maritime choke points turn into toll booths? We usually think of global trade as this highly efficient, frictionless system. But the reality is, geography forces massive amounts of the world's goods through some very narrow, localized bottlenecks. And when someone figures out how to monetize those bottlenecks, well, it creates massive economic ripples that eventually hit your wallet at the local store.
Here's our roadmap for this explainer. First, we'll look at the new toll booth itself. Then, we'll contrast peacetime versus conflict tolls, crunch the supply chain math, look at the compliance trap, and finally, explore how this is rewriting global trade economics.
All right, Section 1, the new toll booth and Iran's strategy.
Right now, Iran is actively charging ships to pass through the Strait of Hormuz. And get this, ships are actually paying. Iran's parliament recently confirmed that the very first toll revenues have been received and successfully credited straight to their central bank. We're talking about ships carrying oil, gas, containers, you name it, all following approved routes coordinated by Iran's maritime authorities. So a sovereign nation has effectively turned the most important maritime choke point on Earth into its own personal revenue extraction mechanism.
Now, you already know the principle of freedom of navigation. It's the idea that ships can transit international straits freely, without paying any sort of tribute to the countries bordering them. It is literally the invisible foundation of our entire globalized economy. But what we're seeing in Hormuz right now is a direct, undeniable challenge to that foundation. It's proving that, practically speaking, forced toll collection works, which puts massive cracks in the bedrock of how the modern trading system actually functions.
Moving on to Section 2, peacetime versus conflict tolls, and why this is setting a very dangerous precedent.
Let's contrast this with something familiar, like the Suez Canal. Yes, Egypt charges tolls on the Suez. It's roughly $700,000 for a large vessel. But that's a peacetime, commercial arrangement based on international treaties and decades of established norms. The Hormuz toll is a completely different beast. It's being imposed right in the middle of a military conflict, entirely under duress, with absolutely zero international agreement and no published rate schedule. And crazy enough, plans are already being reviewed to turn this wartime tactic into a permanent sovereign revenue stream.
And here is why that matters globally. If this model sticks, it creates an incredibly dangerous template. Just think about other vital choke points: Indonesia and the Malacca Strait, Yemen and the Bab el-Mandeb, or the Danish Straits. If the Hormuz model actually succeeds, literally any nation with the right geography and a half-decent navy might decide, hey, let's convert this free international passage into paid passage.
Okay, Section 3, the supply chain math. Let's look at the brutal cost-benefit analysis happening behind closed doors right now.
10 to 15, that is the crucial number you need to keep in mind. Because if a massive shipping company decides they're absolutely not going to pay Iran's toll, their main alternative is to reroute the entire ship all the way around the continent of Africa. And that massive detour? It adds 10 to 15 extra days to a global delivery schedule.
So the stark economics break down exactly like this. Option 1, just pay Iran's toll. The exact fee is unspecified, but honestly, it represents a much easier path of compliance. Option 2, reroute via Africa. Sure, you avoid the toll, but you're hit with hundreds of thousands of dollars in extra fuel, totally ruined delivery timelines, and sky-high operational costs. So the brutal reality for global shipping giants is simple. They choose to pay the toll simply because it is significantly cheaper and more efficient than the alternative.
Which leads us nicely into Section 4, the compliance trap, and the massive gap between rhetoric and reality.
The U.S. response to all this has been, well, a bit contradictory. Officially, the rhetoric is that the U.S. has control and the strait remains open. But practically speaking, on the water, U.S. warships are busy targeting port blockades, meaning ships going to and from Iranian ports, but they aren't exactly out there intercepting the toll collectors in the strait itself. For the most part, the commercial vessels quietly paying the transit toll are just left alone to pass through.
Meanwhile, you have quotes like this from Iran's parliament speaker. Reopening the Strait of Hormuz is not possible amid a blatant violation of the ceasefire. The translation here couldn't be clearer.
Iran is asserting that they control the strait, that they set the terms of passage, and right now, those terms explicitly include paying up.
Finally, Section 5, Rewriting Global Trade Economics. Let's dig into the macroeconomic fallout.
If this toll actually becomes the new normal, it essentially acts as a universal tax on global supply chains. Just think about the sheer volume of physical commodities impacted here. Every single barrel of oil, every container of electronics or manufactured goods, every liquid natural gas cargo moving through the Strait of Hormuz will essentially carry a geopolitical tax. The scale of the economic ripple effect is staggering.
And here's why this matters to you and me. These increased transit costs, they don't just vanish. They inevitably ripple outward. When shipping companies are forced to pay a sudden toll, they don't absorb that cost out of the goodness of their hearts. They pass it right down the line. This directly inflates prices for everyday consumers all over the world. So that geopolitical toll booth in Hormuz literally makes the fuel in your car, the energy heating your home, and the basic products at your local store noticeably more expensive.
There's a quote from our source material that absolutely hits the nail on the head regarding this profound shift. International norms die with a cost-benefit calculation that makes compliance easier than resistance. It's a sobering thought, right? Unprecedented global disruptions don't always require massive, dramatic wars. Sometimes the world order shifts simply because the path of least economic resistance allows a brand new, highly expensive rule to become permanent.
And honestly, the sheer speed of this transformation might be the most alarming part of the whole shebang. Like we mentioned earlier, the Suez Canal took decades to slowly establish and normalize its commercial toll system through endless treaties and international agreements. The Strait of Hormuz, they're pulling it off in a matter of weeks. The underlying economics of global trade are being fundamentally rewritten overnight, and the world is kind of just watching and, well, paying the bill.
So I want to leave you with this provocative question to chew on. Once choke points are successfully monetized under extreme duress like this, can global trade ever really go back to the way it was? If the invisible foundation of free navigation cracks and paying a ransom for passage becomes the standard cost of doing business, our global supply chains might just be far more fragile and way more expensive than we ever wanted to admit. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep learning, stay curious, and I'll see you next time.